In the distant halls of the Galactic Council, where hundreds of species gathered to maintain balance across the stars, a new topic had begun to stir quiet discussions and subtle whispers. Among the Council's top scientists, something unusual had been noticed about a species long thought to be harmless, a species that had arrived late to the galactic stage, yet was spreading faster than anyone had expected. That species was none other than humanity, Maka, a senior biologist known for her deep studies of life forms across several systems, received a confidential assignment directly from the high seats of the Council. She was chosen not because she had experience with humans, but because she asked questions others often ignored. Her task sounded simple on the surface: investigate the cause behind humanity's rapid planetary expansion and their unusual population patterns. But as soon as Maka began her review, she felt that something was deeply different about this case. She studied records gathered from human colonies across multiple sectors. These colonies were not only surviving but growing faster than any other known settlements. Other species followed complex birth schedules, used regulated genetic labs, and controlled population levels with extreme precision. Humans, on the other hand, seemed to multiply at a pace that defied logic. On barren moons, in storm-filled planets, inside ships drifting in space, humans kept growing in number without any centralized system to manage their expansion. With a small team of 3 assistants, Maka traveled to Earth's orbital station, which served as a gateway for galactic researchers. From there, she could observe human cities and request live data directly from Earth-based administrators. The more she studied their numbers, the more questions began to form in her mind. Birth rates varied but always stayed high enough to show continued growth. Survival rates among newborns were surprisingly good, despite Earth's history of conflict and environmental damage. Where other species reduced reproduction to a minimal cycle, humans had no such barriers. They adapted. They found ways to survive. And they kept reproducing. What confused Maka even more was how deeply tied reproduction was to human emotions. It wasn't simply a biological action for them. It came with stories, relationships, choices, mistakes, and deep care. Their method was neither clean nor calculated, yet it worked with strange efficiency. She noticed how humans raised children in flexible units, often not bound to rigid family structures seen in many other civilizations. This meant they could adjust faster in dangerous environments, sharing responsibilities and keeping children safe even in the harshest conditions. As her research continued, Maka requested a visit to a human colony on Mars. From her ship's window, she saw the bright domes of the settlements glowing like soft embers in the red dust. Inside those domes, families were already preparing for another cycle of expansion. New habitats were being built, medical units were active around the clock, and schools were opening every few months. It didn't look like a struggling outpost. It looked like a growing city with a pulse of its own. Something strange clicked in Maka's thoughts. Humans were not only multiplying, they were expanding like a rising wave. There was no pause between generations. There was no single leader directing population growth. It was happening naturally, almost like breathing. Maka stood at the edge of the colony and watched a group of children running through the open square near a construction site. Laughter echoed, no fear in their eyes, no sign of pressure. Just life, endless and unstoppable. She began to wonder if this was more than just a biological function. Perhaps this was a hidden strength, a force that had been overlooked by the HFY Council and other advanced species. They had all focused on military power, technology, and diplomacy, but none had considered reproduction as a form of expansion. Maka took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling with both fascination and quiet concern. The Council had asked for a report on numbers. What she had found was something far more powerful: a species that did not conquer with weapons, but with persistence and life itself. And this was only the beginning. Maka returned from the Martian colony with more questions than answers. Her mind refused to settle as she sat in her observation chamber inside the orbital station. The data she collected spun like a whirlpool in her thoughts. Every chart, every video feed, every interview pointed to the same strange truth: humans were not only capable of surviving in impossible places, but they were also thriving with a force that came not from control or structure, but from sheer natural drive. She began sorting through genetic samples, comparing human DNA with other sentient species. Most species in the galaxy had evolved in a way that restricted or slowed down reproduction. It was seen as progress, as a sign of becoming more civilized and efficient. In contrast, humans showed no such restraint. Their genetics allowed wide variations, their reproductive windows stretched across decades, and they didn't require labs or government approvals to start families. They didn't need to wait for permission. They simply lived, and living for them meant creating life. Maka noticed how their physical biology supported this process. Human bodies were built with resilience. Their immune systems adapted rapidly. Their recovery after childbirth was faster than most intelligent life forms. And strangely, they didn't rely on cloning chambers or artificial wombs. They trusted nature. Their bonds, though sometimes unpredictable, created circles of care and protection around the young. They didn't just reproduce as a function. They did it with meaning, even in situations of danger or loss. This emotional connection confused Maka at first. But the more she studied it, the more she realized it was a kind of energy other species did not possess. Meanwhile, Lauro, another biologist in her team, began to grow uncomfortable with what they were discovering. He observed how human populations rebounded after disasters. He watched footage from war-torn regions on Earth, only to find those same regions full of life within a single generation. No matter how harsh the history, humans found a way to build again, to love again, to bring children into a world that had once burned. He whispered once during a team meeting that humanity's greatest strength might be something the rest of the galaxy would never be able to stop. Maka didn't disagree. She had started this research expecting to write a report about human biology. Instead, she found herself trying to understand a force that was both ancient and unstoppable. The power didn't come from aggression or control. It came from something far simpler, yet far more dangerous in its persistence. It came from hope, from instinct. From a refusal to vanish, she interviewed a human doctor working in a deep space medical center. The doctor, calm and kind, spoke about childbirth not as a clinical process, but as a shared miracle. She told Maka stories of mothers giving birth during asteroid storms, of fathers carrying their children through radiation zones, of communities raising orphans together after entire regions were lost in conflict. Each story left a mark in Maka's mind. This wasn't a pattern of survival. It was a rhythm of life that refused to be broken in other species. Birth was carefully scheduled, monitored, and often limited. It was treated like a transaction or a task. But for humans, reproduction was life celebration. It brought together pain and joy, chaos and calm. It was the thread that tied generations without needing permission from any authority. Maka realized that this was not just biology. It was strategy without design. It was instinct woven into society. It was growth without end. Her final test was an emotional one. She requested access to human cultural materials, films, books, songs, and personal messages. She watched as humans spoke about their children, not just as responsibilities but as dreams. Future astronauts, future poets, future builders, future leaders. They imagined the next generation with pride, not as a burden. And this imagination fed their determination to continue. No matter how cold the planets or how distant the stars, by the end of her research cycle, Maka no longer saw humans as a simple species. She saw them as a rising tide. One that never asked for space politely. One that never waited for an invitation. One that never stopped growing. She stood by the station window one night, looking down at Earth glowing below, and whispered a thought she hadn't meant to say aloud. This is not just reproduction. This is how they take over the stars. When Maka submitted her initial findings to the Galactic Council, she expected questions about accuracy, maybe even a quiet dismissal of her report as overexcited interpretation. But what followed was far from what she imagined. The council chambers filled with a strange silence as the data flashed across the holograms. Population graphs showing unstoppable growth, visual logs of settlements built in record time, colony reports listing birth statistics that outpaced even the most aggressive species in known history. No one spoke for several minutes. Then quiet voices began to murmur, some amused, some doubtful, others clearly disturbed. The younger species among the council laughed it off. They said humans were enthusiastic and disorganized, that their passion would burn out as soon as they hit the limits of their own reach. But the older species, those who had survived ancient galactic conflicts, stared at the data with deep unease. They had seen what happened when a species grew not by war, but by roots sinking into every corner of space and becoming impossible to remove without burning entire systems. To Ashmaka was summoned again, this time not for review, but for deeper questions. The council wanted more than numbers now. They wanted to understand how humans kept their societies stable under such growth, how they avoided collapse, how their young were educated so quickly, and how their systems didn't fall apart under population pressure. Maka knew she needed answers that went beyond science. So she left the comfort of the observation station and returned to human colonies, this time not as a biologist, but as a quiet observer of their daily lives. She landed in a distant human colony nestled in the icy fields of a frozen planet. Colony was surrounded by storms, and the terrain was unfit for most forms of life. Yet humans had carved out warm homes beneath the frost, powered by energy cells and supported by underground farming. It wasn't luxury, but it was alive. And what shocked Maka most was the sound of laughter, the sight of children playing beside technicians, the presence of schools and clinics already functioning despite the settlement being only 3 years old. She spoke to engineers who also served as teachers, to nurses who doubled as guardians. She noticed how responsibilities were shared, how knowledge was passed down not in decades, but in days. Children were taught survival from the moment they could walk. They were not coddled, yet not abandoned either. They were shaped to fit into the flow of their growing world. It was not just about numbers anymore. It was about speed, resilience, and constant motion. One night, as snow howled outside the main building, Maka sat beside a human historian named Aaron who had once served in military command. His eyes were tired but steady, and his voice carried no pride, only truth. When she asked how humans had survived so many wars against species with superior firepower, he answered with calm certainty. He said humans never won by crushing their enemies. They won by being impossible to erase. For every city that fell, 10 villages rose. For every ship lost, 2 were built. For every child gone, a dozen were born and raised with a memory that turned into strength. Maka listened as he described battles where humans had no clear strategy other than endurance. Colonies that had been wiped out came back to life in less than a decade. Enemies who tried to hold human territory found themselves surrounded by new generations they had never seen coming. Victory never came through the front lines. It came through the back doors of time, through the quiet growth that never stopped, through the belief that as long as one child survived, humanity would not fall. These words stayed with Maka as she returned to the station. Her dreams were filled with the sound of human cities rising like songs in forgotten lands. She saw images of cradles beside command consoles, of families eating beside star maps, of new languages forming in places that had never seen life before. And behind it all, there was no great leader commanding this growth. It was happening naturally, like rivers flowing downhill. There was no enemy to point at, no weapon to ban. It was life itself, unbound and fearless. When Maka sat again before the council, she no longer hesitated. She spoke not as a scientist, but as a witness. She told them that humans didn't need to conquer to win, they just needed time. That their greatest strategy was not written in war manuals, but in the rhythm of birth and care and building. That by the time anyone noticed, they were already everywhere and still growing. The council members were no longer laughing. The air in the chamber had shifted. What had started as curiosity was now turning into a quiet alarm that settled like dust on their ancient robes. They reviewed Maka's updated report again and again, each time with greater unease. The idea that humanity was expanding so fast had once seemed amusing, maybe even impressive. But now the truth stood clearer than before. It wasn't just about population growth, it was about momentum. It was about a deep force hiding behind everyday life. Maka was invited to a closed session, the kind that included only high-ranking voices from the oldest civilizations, the ones who remembered fallen empires. They asked her if this growth had an end. Could humans be slowed down with diplomacy, or by limiting resources, or through carefully applied pressure in trade zones? Maka gave the only answer she could. No, not because humans resisted, not because they had secret plans, but because they didn't wait for permission. They grew like nature itself, not with intention to dominate, but with the unstoppable rhythm of survival. And yet something still felt missing to Maka. There had to be more than just instincts. Some deeper pattern that even humans themselves might not have fully understood. To find it, she decided to go further than she ever had. She requested direct interviews with human historians and former commanders. Not military officials in power, but those who had lived through conflict and stepped away with the weight of memory still in their eyes. One of them was an older man named Ile who had lived through 2 major colony wars and later worked as an advisor for planetary recovery missions. He welcomed Maka not with caution, but with kindness. His room was filled with old books, drawings from children he had mentored, and devices patched together from decades of experience. When she asked him why humans expanded even when they had enough space and resources, he smiled gently before answering. He told her something no report had mentioned. That for humans, each new life was a message, a statement to the universe that they were still here. Every birth was more than biology. It was defiance. It was memory passed through blood and breath. It was the answer to every loss. When their cities were burned, they built schools before rebuilding towers. When they lost people, they planted trees or named new children after them. It was never about just replacing numbers. It was about refusing to be forgotten. Maka sat in silence for a long time after that. She finally understood what the data had failed to say. Humans didn't grow fast because they wanted power. They grew because they carried pain that never fully faded. Their expansion was not a thirst for land or control. It was the echo of a long cry for belonging in a galaxy that had once ignored them. They spread across planets not to conquer, but to leave behind proof that they mattered, that they had suffered and still continued. And perhaps the most powerful thing of all was that they didn't need a single mind to organize it. The growth happened in villages, in ships, in broken homes, in joyful marriages, and in quiet places full of sorrow. There was no council guiding their rise, no law ordering it. It was the silent agreement between generations to never let the fire go out. And that made it almost impossible to stop. Maka added a final entry to her report. She warned that limiting human expansion with rules or treaties would not work. That war would not destroy them. That even tragedy had failed to slow them. Because at the core of their being, humans had built a weapon no other species understood. A weapon not made of metal or energy, but of life itself. She named it not with fear, but with clarity. Reproduction as a system. Growth as a language, memory as a seed. Maka knew that if the galaxy ever turned against humans again, it would not. Find a weak enemy. It would find the forest planted in every corner of the stars. And by the time that forest was noticed, it would already be too late. Her final message was simple. Humanity does not charge forward. It spreads quietly. And when it rises together. The council chambers, once filled with debates and divided opinions, had grown quieter with each passing day. Micah's final report had spread across every major seat of power, not through public channels or news feeds, but through private hands and sealed communications. The truth was no longer something they could ignore. Human expansion was not a theory. It was a reality. It could not be paused by treaties or controlled by regulation. It could not be stopped by fear or violence. It had become a living force moving through the galaxy. Maka had returned to her station far above Earth, not to continue research but simply to observe. Her work was complete, her warnings delivered. Now she stood beside the viewing glass each morning and watched the blue planet below, where lights shimmered through clouds and new cities blinked into existence with each sunrise. Earth was not alone in its brightness anymore. Across distant stars, small human colonies had begun to glow, like tiny suns on forgotten planets. Each one a story, a breath, a heartbeat in the vast silence of space. The council had met again, this time not to question, but to decide. And what they chose was not war, not retreat, but respect. Agreements were redrawn. Colonial zones were reviewed. Human settlements were granted space, not because the council wished to reward them, but because they finally understood. You could push back against armies. You could argue with governments, but you could not argue with birth. You could not argue with people raising children under Skyles's domes or singing lullabies in the dark corners of abandoned ships. These were not threats. They were roots sinking deeper with each generation. Maka traveled once more, this time to a newer colony on a far-off planet with no official name, a place that hadn't existed on any galactic chart even 5 years ago. And yet when she arrived, she found a town already living in full rhythm. Houses made from local stone, schools humming with lessons, fields growing beneath artificial suns. And in the center of it all, a celebration was underway, a gathering for the naming of a newborn child. She stood at the edge, unseen among the crowd, and watched as humans held candles and sang old songs passed down through centuries. There was laughter and food and warm embraces. And at the heart of this moment, a child swaddled in soft cloth was given a name that would now echo in that world forever. Maka did not know the child. She would never meet them again. But she understood what the moment meant. It meant the future had already begun later that night. She recorded a personal entry, not for the council or any scientific archive, but for herself. She spoke of what she had seen, not just in data or statistics, but in faces and voices. She described how humans carried memories not in machines, but in stories. How they built not because they were told to, but because they believed tomorrow could be better. And how their strength came not from domination, but from an unstoppable trust in life. Her words flowed gently like the wind, across silent fields. She said humans do not conquer galaxies, they grow into them. They do not raise empires, they raise children. And in doing so, they leave behind not fear, but roots. They mark planets with laughter. They turn stone into shelter. They fill silence with voices. And when time moves on, their traces remain not as monuments, but as living things that continue to grow long after battles have ended. The galaxy did not fall before humanity. It adjusted. It made space. It opened doors that had once been closed, and began to listen instead of command. And through it all, humans never changed their rhythm. They kept moving forward, not with fleets or invasions, but with families, with love, with the quiet power of another life beginning in the last line of her private record. Maka wrote something that would stay with her for the rest of her days. Not a warning, not a theory. Just truth. If you try to erase them, you only plant them. Deeper. If you give them space, they fill it with meaning. And if you leave them alone, they will still find you, not with war, but with children asking questions about the stars, and in those questions lives the future of every world, the end.